At dawn on August 21st, 1968, 1,000 Soviet tanks swept into the center of Prague to crush the liberal reforms that had promised hope, freedom, and a new style of government to the people of Czechoslovakia. The trouble between the USSR and its satellite country had been brewing for several months. Alexander Dubček, the new Czech leader, was attempting to distance his country from the hardline Stalinist policies of the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries. He began to relax controls on the press and even initiated democratic reforms. Moscow and the rest of the communist bloc were vehemently opposed to any liberal reforms and tried every possible means to force the Czechs back into line. After months of political maneuvering and threats, Russian troops began massing on the border. Moscow demanded one last meeting.
Would the Russians accept the Czech break from the Kremlin line? They talked and talked. Behind locked doors, the reformist Czechs struggled to convince the Kremlin hierarchy of their loyalty, despite their wish for freedom. After 4 days, it was over. The Russians emerged, followed by the Czechs. Party chief Alexander Dubček and his colleagues were in good spirits. The nation saw hope in their smiles.
But the people's hope for freedom would not be fulfilled. On the morning of August 21st, threats became reality as Soviet tanks and troops descended upon Czechoslovakia.
The citizens of Prague knew the full meaning of occupation by force. The Russians, while supposedly their allies, were not wanted. The fighting spirit of many Czechs was aroused. They retaliated against overwhelming power. But it showed the free world, and Russia too, that their desire to shape their own destiny was stronger even than the heaviest tank or the biggest gun. The Czechs didn't take their bondage lightly. They fought, they disobeyed curfew regulations, they held strikes, and more passively, they did their damnedest not to cooperate with those who had come from outside to regulate their way of life. In the midst of their troubles was the added concern for their leaders, Dubček, Svoboda, and others who had disappeared. However, it was learned they were in Moscow, having talks with the Kremlin bosses. They talked, and the world wondered.
Eventually, Dubček saw the futility of fighting a superior military power and was forced to yield to the Soviets. Although protest and resistance continued throughout the country, it would be another 20 years before the Czechs would be able to throw off the yoke of communist domination and fulfill the promise of that Prague Spring morning of August 21st, 1968.